Mehrunes Dagon, Lord of Destruction, Change, Revolution, and Ambition. Despite seemingly appearing to just be a representation of the devil in many depictions, Dagon is quite easily one of the more interesting of the princes, and with the recent release of the Oblivion remaster, what better time to dive into the force behind the game's main quest. But of course, as you're well aware, Oblivion was not the first appearance of Dagon, being the fourth main installment in the series. We're going to go through each of the games he appears in and discuss and expand on the information contained within to keep a sense of order to things, and so you can see how the prince was built upon, changed, and added to over the years. So, whilst we won't be touching on his origins at the start of this video as you may expect, we will get there when it is appropriate. This will, of course, be mainly an audio-driven experience, so feel free to stick this on whilst you're doing other things. The only part I imagine I'll have trouble with later are the protonymics and neonymics, so they'll be written on screen. And if you don't know what that means, then all the more reason to keep on listening. Remember to subscribe if you enjoyed this kind of content so I know to make more of it, and let's get started. And we, of course, start with Elder Scrolls Arena, the first game in the series. Surprisingly, there isn't a ton to talk about here, but for very good reason. You see, the events of Arena focus on the Eternal Champion assembling the pieces of the Staff of Chaos in order to stop Yeager Tharn, who imprisoned the Emperor in a pocket realm of Oblivion. But it turns out that Dagon was actually working with Tharn, perhaps being the one who imprisoned him within a pocket realm, or perhaps giving Tharn the means to do so, but regardless, this is what leads us to the Elder Scrolls Battlespire. Battlespire takes place during the events of Arena and follows the story of the Apprentice, the player character, journeying through the titular Battlespire in the aftermath of an invasion led by Dagon. Naturally, there's a lot more to talk about here. Now, the Battlespire was an imperial training ground for mages and connected to various planes of Oblivion. This resulted in Dagon invading both Shade Perilous, a pocket realm of the Everglow presided over by Nocturnal, and the Soul Cairn, home of the Ideal Masters. Yes, that Soul Cairn from Skyrim. But these invasions, combined with Dagon's deal with Yeager Tharn, who wanted the installation destroyed in order to eliminate any magical competition, allowed his forces to sweep through the Battlespire, killing any who stood before them. And so, we come back to the Apprentice. For how does a mortal defeat a god? Well, to answer that, we need to go back to lay some groundwork. At some point before the events of Battlespire, Dagon was involved in another deal. A little edit here, but I've been looking over a lot of Battlespire dialogue for this section, and the player character is actually unhinged. It's amazing. This guy wants you to find his cat, and your response is, "You want me to find a cat? Fine. Not much else to do but wander around the damn island looking for a damn cat. Fine. Fine. Goodbye." Huge thank you, of course, to UASP for cataloging all this dialogue. I'll link to it down below. Anyway, Dagon entered into a deal with this cat owner, and knowing that Dagon wouldn't stay true to his word, he wore armor that would defend him against Oathbreakers. This armor just so happened to be the Savior's hide. In theory, this plan would allow him to force Dagon into fulfilling his wish, as Dagon wouldn't be able to hurt him, and he could just use Dagon's protonymic, we'll come back to what that is in a second, to banish him back to Oblivion. Unfortunately, despite the banishing part being successful, Dagon granted his wish in a twisted manner. Trymere, our cat-owning friend, wished to live forever in his hometown, so Dagon tore his town from Nirn and cast it into Oblivion with Trymere still inside, now never dying, but still aging. So how is this relevant to Battlespire? Well, after journeying through the Battlespire and the plains of the Soul Cairn and Shade Perilous, as well as a small run-in with one of the great hunts of her scene, the Apprentice, of course, met Trymere, his town now known as the realm of the Chimera of Desolation. This is where the Apprentice would obtain the Savior's hide, as well as the protonymic and knowledge of a neonymic. A protonymic is the true name of a Daedric prince, knowledge of which, it would seem, allow the banishing of said princes. However, after this was used against Dagon, he obtained a neonymic, a second name which seals the first, requiring the Banisher to now possess both. Eventually, through various dealings and slayings of Daedra, the apprentice would come to learn the names of Dagon as... yeah, I'm not even going to try and pronounce those, I'll leave them on the screen. Smart move for Dagon to make that neonymic impossible to pronounce though. Now, because nothing is ever easy, the apprentice would need one last item to defeat Dagon, a weapon made from his essence. In theory, the Razor could probably fulfill this purpose, but in this case it was an artifact known as the Sword of the Moonreaver, an artifact so powerful that it would never be mentioned again for some reason. This was in the possession of a dark seducer who apparently was also Dagon's lover, at least according to a letter given by a Dromore. This dark seducer was also one of those given a Daedric crescent, another artifact of Dagon. After the events of Battlespire, these crescents would all be destroyed by the Empire, aside from one, which would somehow make its way to Tamriel. But regardless, the apprentice would claim the Sword of the Moonreaver and head to face Dagon at his hunting lodge in the Deadlands, which we will cover more in depth later. There are a lot of Hircine Dagon crossovers in Battlespire. It almost seems like they wanted Hircine to be subservient to Dagon in some way. But this is never really elaborated on ever again. In fact, we know this was at least an initial idea due to a comment from Gary Noonan, one of the developers, stating that they had discussed Hircine being one of Dagon's top generals. Remember, this game is old by today's standards. A lot of lore from this era is experimental and inconsistent. So hey, some things never change. But anyway, the apprentice defeats Dagon with the artifacts and banishes him back to Oblivion. Hooray, good for them. But this would also greatly undermine Yegorthon's power and likely gave the Eternal Champion of Arena a bit of an easier time. Next up is Daggerfall, and quite appropriately for the title, all Dagon really does here is give a quest for the Razor. That's pretty much it. Though it does give us confirmation that his summoning day is the 20th of Sun's Dusk. But this seems as good a time as any to discuss the Razor of Mehrunes Dagon. The dagger is also known as the Dagger of the Final Wounds, the Blade of the Righteous, and the Kingslayer. Even though I don't actually think there's any recorded evidence of the weapon being used to kill a king, I don't know. But regardless, the Razor is a powerful artifact, being able to instantly kill those it cuts, their souls being sent to Dagon. But an interesting one is everyone's favourite Telvanni mage, Neloth. Even more interesting was that it was stolen off of him by a group of acrobats, who then proceeded to use it as a prop in their show. But moving on to Morrowind, Morrowind also doesn't see much direct action from Dagon, but does provide us with a myriad of books and dialogue to learn from, as well as a great deal of cultural significance to the Dunmer. So let's start there. Now, to understand the Dunmer's interpretation, you need to understand some elements of their culture historically. The Dunmer initially worshipped quite the plethora of Daedra. Mephala, Boethia, and Azura were the good Daedra, and Sheogorath, Malakath, Molag Bal, and Mehrunes Dagon were the bad Daedra. Despite the generalization of bad, these four Daedra, also referred to as the House of Troubles after the rise of the Tribunal, were seen as testing gods. Sheogorath for mental, Molag Bal for purity, Malakath for physical, and Dagon for the land, natural disasters, and the general inhospitableness of Morrowind. These beliefs dated all the way back to the days of the Chimer. The Chimer were golden-skinned before being cursed to have the ashen skin and red eyes that we know today. They became the Dunmer, but that's a story for another time. And all this happened sometime before the First Era. The specifics are rather hard to nail down, but regardless, this was the faith for a very long time, until the Tribunal came along. The Tribunal of Sothasil, Almalexia, and Vivec essentially replaced the good Daedra, and whilst the House of Troubles remained and were gifted the aforementioned title, they were certainly unhappy about these mortal upstarts who thought they could play at being gods. Now, in order to keep the peace, Sothasil sought out a truce with the 8 Daedric princes he considered threatening enough to warrant one, Mehrunes among them. This would be known as the Cold Harbor Compact. Unfortunately, like every allegiance, spell, shield, truce or barrier to oblivion there's ever been, it didn't really work. Dagon would be summoned by his scorned lover on the 20th of Sun's dusk and destroy the city of Mournhold. Sotasil and Almalexia showed up, and Sotasil used his protonymic to banish Dagon back to oblivion. Now this was back in the First Era, which really begs the question as to why he didn't get a neonymic sooner, but I digress. Dagon after this point would spend a great deal of time perfecting his Oblivion gates, though not before an extra plot or two, but we'll get to that in the ESO section. Now, despite all his destruction, the Dunmer do, of course, still try and appease Dagon, as well as the rest of the testing gods, which is why Morrowind doesn't shy away from the Daedric princes like many other cultures do. They even have an event dedicated to Dagon. This event takes place during the initiation pilgrimage of the Tribunal Temple. The event retells the story of a battle between Dagon and Vivec, in which Vivec refused to fight an unarmed Dagon, and so presented him with his sword. And given that we're talking about Morrowind here, that could be both literal and a euphemism, but regardless, the pilgrim plays the role of Vivec in reenacting the scene, and Dagon is played by a bound Dremora. This symbolizes the simultaneous animosity and respect the two have for one another. As for Dagon's appearance during the events of Morrowind, it's very similar for Daggerfall. The player does a task and is rewarded with the Razor, but before we leave Morrowind, two artifacts from Battlespire do appear here: the Daedric Crescent and the Spear of Bitter Mercy, which was said to be one of the many spears forged by Dagon and given to Hircine for his hunts. Again, there's that weird subservient Hircine thing popping up again. It's pretty inconsequential though. The only other notable thing to mention is that Dagon is referenced multiple times in the 36 lessons of Vivec, but it doesn't tell us much we don't already know. Anyway, next up we have the big one. It's Oblivion time. Oblivion begins with the assassination of Emperor Uriel VII's children by the Mythic Dawn. So let's talk about who the hell they are. The Mythic Dawn are a cult dedicated to the worship of Mehrunes Dagon and led by Mankar Cameron. He would go on to teach his followers through the knowledge given to him in the Mysterium Xarxes. The Mysterium was said to have been written by Dagon himself, and Cameron used it to write the volumes of his commentaries, books that would lead one dedicated enough into joining the cult. The defining belief of the cult is the idea that Mundus is not separate from Oblivion and is in fact another realm, specifically the realm of Lorkhan, who they also believe to be a Daedric prince. Lorkhan, for those who don't know, is the one who, through one means or another, is responsible for the creation of the mortal plane. Therefore, in Lorkhan's absence, it is only logical that another Daedric prince should take his place. An argument so convincing, many players have come around to it too, at least the part about Lorkhan being a Daedra. Personally, I'm on the fence. In theory, the only difference between the Aedra and Daedra to begin with is whether or not they helped Lorkhan by giving up their power. Lorkhan himself has always been excluded from these classifications. Personally, I've always seen Lorkhan as a sort of mix of the two, closer to something like Magnus. After all, no one realm of Oblivion required the creation methods of Mundus, or indeed has the same properties. You could argue that Lorkhan is the same type of being as the Daedric princes of the time, but then so were the Aedra. In fact, Lorkhan has, in older scripts, been referred to as the Ninth Divine. The only difference between the two is classification, and the classification of either doesn't fit. But regardless, we must continue with our explanation of the Xarxes and its commentaries, because this is where we finally come to Dagon's origins. The commentaries claim that Dagon was created by the Magna G, the ancient spirit followers of Magnus in the bowels of Lig. And this is where things start to get confusing, because we don't actually have a canon explanation as to what Lig is. We have two potential options, but both come with caveats. The first is the explanation offered by ex-Bethesda writer Michael Kirkbride, who names Lig as an adjacent place, almost like a parallel world or a shadow or an imprint of Mundus on the rest of reality. The issue being that he is an ex-writer. It may have been his intention all along, but then we get the whole death of the author argument, but you're free to take it as canon if you will. Our next option is that Lig is a part of a separate Kalpa. a separate cycle, the universe before this one, if you will. This is very loosely supported in canon by a book in ESO released fairly recently, but the book isn't even clear what exactly the Cowper is in reference to, and many people don't consider ESO to be canon at all. Bethesda, however, does, but it is perfectly valid to not accept lore added since Oblivion's release to be relevant, as it wasn't there to inform the decisions made during development, which is another reason many prefer the Kirkbride view on things. But regardless, the book does claim Dagon was created here by the Magna G. Lake was said to be ruled over by the crustacean-like dregs, and its inhabitants were enslaved and downtrodden. Dagon was created to be the hope of these people, and rose up to destroy the oppressors, and the Dreg were destroyed utterly by the power of Dagon's revolution. Dagon being a symbol for not only destruction but revolution is a very important part of his character, and something we will explore later on. So, returning to the beginning of this section, the children of the Emperor were murdered, and the Emperor himself would be soon to follow. But why did this need to happen for Dagon's plan to work? Well, for that, we need a quick history lesson. Back in the ages of the Aliens and before the beginning of the First Era, the Needs, the humans of that time, were kept as slaves, and long story short, a woman named Alicia rose up and led a revolution, quite like Dagon himself, to overthrow them. Once this was done, she was bestowed the Amulet of Kings, and by the powers of Akatosh, the dragon fires were lit, preventing the Daedra from invading Tamriel, unless the plot needs them to, so long as a Dragonborn sits on the ruby throne and lights them. So, with no emperor, Dagon is free to invade. Of course, unbeknownst to him, one heir to the throne remains, and you go on a nice quest to close the Oblivion gates and get Martin on the throne. But unfortunately, Martin ends up sacrificing himself and the Amulet of Kings to become an avatar of Akatosh and send Dagon back to Oblivion. Haha, Sean Bean dying joke. But this is where Dagon's sphere of influence being revolution comes in, as we see in our next installment. That's right, it's Skyrim time, and Skyrim, despite only having a little Daedric quest like Daggerfall and Morrowind, is incredibly important to understanding Dagon and the aftermath of the Oblivion Crisis. Skyrim shows us that despite the invasion failing, Dagon has absolutely succeeded in creating power struggles, destruction, and revolution across not just Skyrim, but all of Tamriel. Since the events of the Oblivion Crisis, the balance of power and status quo of Tamriel has been in complete chaos. The war for power and control of the Ruby Throne was followed by the Great War that resulted in the White Gold Concordat and the subsequent losses of the Empire-controlled lands, and of course, the Skyrim Rebellion and Civil War. Dagon has succeeded at reshaping Tamriel as we know it, and that is certainly a victory for the god of destruction, change, revolution, and ambition. In fact, there are some who believe that Dagon purposefully planned the entire Oblivion Crisis to go down the way that it did, and just played everyone for complete fools. Certainly possible for a god, but what do you think? Regardless, the state of Skyrim over 200 years later is still feeling the effects of the Oblivion Crisis. And not just from war, magic has become a sign of malice and evil in a land already distrustful of it. But regardless, remnants remain. A museum to the Mythic Dawn is opened in Dawnstar, featuring the commentaries and even a page from the Mysterium Xarxes. Of course, the real prize from the quest is once again the Razor, which, despite me not mentioning, it was available thanks to downloadable content in Oblivion, but it seemed rather inconsequential, especially given that in the aftermath of the Oblivion Crisis, the Razor was split into pieces and hidden. At least it was until you gather them all up and claim it for yourself. But that chronologically brings us up to now, a land left sundered by war and chaos on the brink of a second Great War that could well spell the end for the Empire, and all because of Dagon. But that is not the end, because we still have everyone's favorite game, The Elder Scrolls Online. The Elder Scrolls Online takes place during the Second Era in an interregnum with no emperor. However, our tale here starts slightly before that. Our tale starts with the Longhouse Emperors. The Longhouse Emperors were the only Everreachmen to ever sit on the Ruby Throne after Durkarank the Black Drake managed to take it. This was, in part, due to a deal struck with Mehrunes Dagon. The Longhouse Emperors would proceed to create something known as the Four Ambitions, which would remain hidden even after the rebellion that led to the end of the Longhouse Emperors. It would only be around 5 years later that any news of these ambitions would crop up at all, and of course, the person who found this information would shortly end up dead, thanks to a group known as the Order of the Waking Flame, another Dagon cult led by a woman named Sister Saldina. The most interesting part of the cult's beliefs is that Dagon is to unmake Mundus in order for Magnus to remake it without its flaws. Aside from that, they're your typical Dagon cult. Though they do have a cool story about Dagon and Molag Bal getting into a fistfight in Cold Harbor, but that's not really relevant. Ironically, following the events we're about to discuss, Saldina and the Waking Flame would meet their end at the hands of the player and a horde of angry Dremora. Anyway, it would be revealed that the ambitions were people imbued with power who could be used via sacrifice or other methods to bring great power and destruction to others. One of the priests of the Order of the Waking Flame managed to sacrifice one of the four ambitions and attempted to use the power to merge the Deadlands into Nirn, which briefly allowed Dagon to appear before the priest was defeated by the protagonist, and the plan was thereby undone. Dagon's next idea was to take the realm known as Fargrave, which was a sort of midpoint between Nirn and Oblivion. His cult of the Waking Flame would attempt to do so, but would, surprise surprise, be stopped by the player. Unfortunately, however, another one of the ambitions had started reading the Mysterium Xarxes while all this was going on, and stole the power from the remaining ambitions, and once again began the process of merging Nirn and Oblivion. But then one of the other ambitions managed to get his power back with the player's help and used Dagon's ego Nimic, because, original ways of doing things are overrated, to allow the player to defeat Dagon and stop the merging. Now, before we finish up with the ESO, we have some more artifacts to discuss that debut here. Oh, you wanted to know what happened to the remaining ambitions? Excellent question. Anyway, the Ground Splitters are a pair of boots that are said to give the wearer powers of destruction, allowing for ferocious kicks and stomps capable of cracking the earth. They give power to such an extent that they are capable of killing a careless wearer, which is exactly what happened to Barg the Avalanche, an Orcish warlord who was gifted the boots by Dagon for his destruction of Breton settlements. And finally, we have the Deadland Hammer. This hammer is mainly used to summon Iron Atronachs, and by me to segue into my next talking point, because it is found in the possession of a Kajiit cult called the Claws of Dagon. Now seems like a great time to get into some of the other cultures' interpretations of Dagon. So, let's start with the Kajiit. The Kajiit know Dagon as Mehrunes, the Fire Cat, and that is actually all I'm going to get into for this section, because I think I would actually have to double the length of this video to explain Kajiit religious beliefs. So I will do that in its own separate video. It is probably my favorite thing ESO has added to the lore, but it is far too complicated to quickly go over right now. There are a lot of concepts in there. The only other truly notable different depiction of Dagon comes from an Argonian tribe whose beliefs were believed by most Argonians to be outdated. However, it was said by the Sulzan tribe that Dagon was a child of Sithis, who they also believed to be a god of destruction. But Daedra worship is not looked upon kindly by most Argonians, leaving the Sulzan as an almost cult-like tribe. The only big missing thing left for us to discuss would be Dagon's realm of Oblivion, the Deadlands. The Deadlands, as I'm sure you know, are a hellish landscape encompassing change and destruction. It's filled with imposing towers and huge gates, but what I find more interesting than the Deadlands itself are the inhabitants. Various clans of Daedra all vie for power here, from the Dremora to the Zivilai to the Shard Eye. This political dynamic between the three was even part of the reason for the success of The Apprentice all the way back in Battlespire, as they were able to ally themselves with Imago's Storm of Clan Dremora, who wished to restore order to the clans in the wake of Dagon's dealings with other Daedric races. But that is all for today. More or less everything you need to know about Mehrunes Dagon. Hopefully, I didn't accidentally miss out anything major, and a big thank you to the unofficial Elder Scrolls pages, specifically for the Battlespire dialogue and ESO information, because I just don't enjoy playing ESO. Anyway, remember to subscribe if you enjoyed, and I will see you next time.